paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
You want answers. I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Warwick Middleton. Warwick is an associate professor in psychiatry at University of Queensland. He is also a fellow and past president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. In 1996, he was the principal psychiatrist in establishing Australia's first unit dedicated to dissociative disorders, the Trauma and Dissociation Unit of Belmont Hospital. He has authored many papers and books. And today, Warwick is joining us from Brisbane, Australia, and it is 5 o'clock in the morning there. The last time I got up that early, I cut the tip of my nose shaving, so it's very dangerous for me to get up that early. But I can see that Warwick doesn't have any tissues on his face, so he's been all right. Today, we're going to talk about a very unsavory truth, and that is incest into adulthood. And I'm going to start out with some numbers that I found that are United States numbers, but I think that most Western countries have similar numbers. 15% of U.S. families have had at least one incest event in the family. 32 million Americans report to have been the victims of incest as a child. 1 in 5 girls have been victims of incest compared to 1 in 4 boys. And 46% of all children under 18 who are raped have been raped by someone in their own family. So give us a background about adult incest, or incest starting in childhood that goes into adulthood.
It's a fascinating sort of window into what a society is kind of really like. I find it sort of somewhat extraordinary that any systematic research into ongoing incest during adulthood never really happened until very recent years. And it's not because it hasn't been going on. We've seen, press reports of that sort of extreme incestuous abuse being published for the last 1.5 centuries. And there's always seems to be a lag between the popular reporting of issues within our society, whether it be, abuse within the church or sexual abuse of children, between the press. That's where you come in, Nick, the reporting fearlessly of what is going on in society, and the more systematic research carried out by the health professions. So you're right about incest being an endemic part of our society. And when Diana Russell was really the first person in the modern era to do epidemiological studies on sexual abuse in society, she found back in, this would be sort of early 1980s, that around 38% of American women, in this case San Francisco, reported being sexually abused in childhood. And of that group, 16% had been exposed to some form of incestuous abuse. And within the whole group, that meant that 4.5% of women had been incestuously abused by a father, stepfather. And when one looks at the sort of the last frontier of extreme abuse, it is abuse that never ends. We've got conditioned, and this was within the scientific literature, conditioned to the notion that all of the studies on incest, dissociative disorders were referring to incest largely in the past tense. Yes, it was something terrible that happened back in childhood or in adolescence, but the assumption was that it was over. And back in the early 90s, I was researching the background abuse histories and clinical phenomenology of what became a group of 62 individuals, mostly women, who fulfilled diagnostic criteria for dissociative identity disorder. And it became apparent way back then that I was dealing with a significant subgroup within that population where the incest had never stopped. And I guess I had some graphic, impressive, for me at the time, encounters with the abusers in some of the cases. And it became very apparent that these people will spin you whatever they think you want to believe, and whichever gives them some sort of an out to explaining the unexplainable. And guess what? They lie with impunity. And when I subsequently made that a focus of systematic research, I was left with my original impression, and my published study back in which came out in 1998, was in rough ballpark figures, about 1 in 8 of people with, at least 1 in 8 of people with a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder were in a situation where, as adults, they had continued to be incestuously abused, usually by a father or stepfather.
You talk about 13% of those 62 individuals.
Yeah, so that's about 1 in 8. Yeah,
being abused into adulthood. And what's really interesting, as an example, and I've read the 3 papers that you sent me. As an example of this, you talk about Joseph Fritzl, who was an Austrian who abused his daughter for many, many years, and
31 years.
Could you give us an idea about him? He was a very evil man.
There are some things about Fritzl that are just a little different from the average incestuous abuser who abuses their child or children into adulthood. Pardon me. He actually had previously been convicted of serious sexual abuse offence, so he'd actually done jail time. The vast majority of abusers in this spectrum are outwardly respectable citizens, usually stably married, and usually quite often, the pillar of the local church. Fritzl, in many ways, he fitted that picture, despite his earlier conviction for sexual abuse of a woman. He was a prosperous, successful businessman, landlord. He lived in a large renovated house. He drove a Mercedes-Benz, and he cultivated this persona that he was this grandfatherly figure who was selflessly taking in the wayward children deposited on his doorstep by his mysterious daughter Elizabeth, who had many years before disappeared, presumably in his story, into a cult, and that on 3 occasions she then deposited a child on his doorstep with a note, and the actual notes were real because he forced Elizabeth to write them. And he was then seen in his local community as an exemplary citizen who was selflessly looking after his grandchildren. The truth was astounding, was that he had abducted Elizabeth, having set up, and he loved tunneling and digging and excavating, having set up an entire small apartment under his house where he imprisoned her, and on threat of being electrocuted, gassed, whatever. And she, in the 24 years she remained in this cellar, she produced 7 incestuously fathered children, one of whom died a few days after birth. Fritzl refused to get medical attention, obviously, because that would have exposed what he was doing. So the child's body was put in his incinerator. And then he had the issue of this progeny of 6 surviving children, 3 of whom at various intervals he deposited on his front doorstep and then took them in as their adoptive grandfather, and the other 3 grew up in the dungeon or the cellar with Elizabeth. And at various times, Fritzl would disappear, go on overseas holidays, and leave his daughter locked in this cellar. And he was their only means of support. So he provided food. It was only when the eldest of the daughter became seriously medically ill that Elizabeth essentially forced him to make up a story and then take it to the local emergency department. And finally, belatedly, someone in authority began to sort of join the dots and realize that the story didn't stack up. And then there was the sort of televised attention on the matter. It's sort of interesting when one looks at it that the response to the world in some quarters was, what is it about Austria? That first it was Adolf Hitler, now we've got Joseph Fritzl. What is it about Austria? And the sad but interesting thing was that, like, with the attention that Fritzl gave to ongoing incest during adulthood, there was suddenly a flood of news stories about Fritzls everywhere. There were American Fritzls and British Fritzls and Australian Fritzls and Swedish Fritzls and South American Fritzls, and et cetera. And in one sort of weird sense, the Joseph Fritzl story was helpful because it flushed out the press reporting based on court findings of similar sorts of people that were in most other countries. I assume they're in all countries, just that some countries had better reporting than others. And of course, in Australia, we had the man from Maui who had incestuously abused his daughter for 30 years, 1 year less than Fritzl abused Elizabeth. And, in England, for example, we had the Sheffield gaffer who had impregnated his 2 daughters 19 times, and so on. There was just an endless number of these people who, and one of the features of them was that in most cases they wanted their daughters to have babies. And some of them, there were 10 or 11 incestuously fathered children, by the time the abuser was arrested.
So do you attribute that to like seismic narcissism?
Yep. If you look at Fritzl, was psychiatrically assessed, and he was psychopathic, remorseless, sadistic. He threatened Elizabeth with guns and gassing and electrocution. And one of the features, when it's a bit of a reverse way of investigating an issue in psychiatry, is that in order to be able to safely talk about the clinical findings of representative examples in real time of people that I met, it was first necessary to publish an account based on the lay literature, which is reporters reporting on court reports and police reports of similar cases.